In the shadowed alleys of history, where truth blurs into myth and whispers carry more weight than records, there exists a tale so strange, so unsettling, that even the bravest dared not repeat it aloud. It begins not with a king or a prophet, but with a nameless mobile slave, a man whose existence was meant to be forgotten, yet whose words would haunt every soul who heard them. Chained by law, but unbound by something far more terrifying, he claimed to see what no living eye should ever witness, the precise moment death would claim its next victim. They called him mad at first, a broken mind forged by cruelty, heat, and endless labor. But when the first prediction came true, laughter turned into uneasy silence. When the second followed with the same dreadful precision, fear crept into the air like a slow poison. By the time the 12th name was spoken and the 12th body fell exactly as he had described, no one dared mock him again. The plantations, the markets, the guarded compounds, all fell under the invisible shadow of his voice. He never begged for mercy. He never asked for freedom. His only curse was knowledge, and his only crime was speaking it. How did a man with no education, no power, and no known connection to the outside world foresee deaths that even physicians and elders could not predict? Was it coincidence, a sick game of fate, or a mystery rooted in forces beyond human understanding? This is the chilling account of the mobile slave who did not run from death. He announced it, one name at a time, with flawless accuracy, leaving behind a trail of terror, disbelief, and a question that still refuses to die. Was he a victim of madness, or the unwilling messenger of something far darker? The chained wanderer known as the mobile slave was never meant to be remembered, never meant to be more than a nameless shadow moving between villages and estates. A body passed from one hand to another like a broken tool with no story worth telling. Yet from the moment he began to speak of death, the air around him shifted in a way no one could explain, as if the earth itself leaned closer to listen. He had always been silent, obeying commands with hollow eyes and a posture shaped by years of submission. His legs marked by irons that clinked softly with every step, his skin burned by sun and scarred by punishment. And still there was something unsettling in the calm with which he moved, a stillness that made people uneasy even before his strange gift revealed itself. It started quietly, almost as a whisper. When he paused during a routine journey and looked toward a distant field where a farmhand laughed, unaware of what awaited him, and in a low voice that barely rose above the wind, he muttered a name followed by a date, speaking as though reciting a fact rather than casting a warning. Those who heard it dismissed the words as madness, the ramblings of a mind broken by cruelty. Yet when the day came and the farmhand fell beneath the collapsing cartwheel exactly as described, the first crack appeared in their certainty. From that moment, the mobile slave no longer moved as just another chained figure, but as a source of unease, a presence that carried an invisible storm with each step. As he continued his wandering existence, dragged from plantation to plantation and through narrow dirt paths bordered by silent trees, the pattern repeated itself. He would lift his eyes briefly, as if watching something unseen pass through the world, and speak a name followed by calm, unflinching detail, describing how the breath would leave a body, where the final moments would unfold, and how the ground would receive the fallen. There was no emotion in his voice, no pleasure or sorrow, only a strange certainty that made his words burrow into the minds of those who overheard him. Echoing long after the sound of his chains faded into the distance, people began to notice that his predictions were not wild guesses or vague superstitions. He did not speak of dreams or omens or symbols. He spoke of real living people, neighbors, overseers, traveling merchants, stable boys, women drawing water from wells, each name specific and unmistakable. When the second and third deaths followed his words with the same terrifying precision, the mobile slave was no longer perceived as merely broken. He became an unsettling phenomenon, a walking contradiction in a world that believed slaves were nothing more than flesh and bone. Whispers grew wherever he passed. Some called him cursed, claiming that misfortune followed his shadow. Others said he had been touched by spirits that walked between life and death. A few dared to believe he was chosen, gifted with sight denied to ordinary men, yet none could ignore the fact that he did not chase attention nor seek rewards. He did not raise his voice or ask to be believed. He spoke only when the vision seized him, then returned to silence, eyes fixed on the horizon as if the future played itself before him like a tragic procession. He could neither stop nor escape. His masters watched him with uncertainty, torn between anger and curiosity. At first, they tried to silence him, punishing him for what they called foolish talk. forcing him to keep his head lowered and his mouth shut. But when his next prediction unfolded exactly as he had said, they hesitated, their cruelty faltering beneath the creeping dread. The idea that a man they owned, a man they fed scraps and bound with iron, could somehow see into the unreachable realm of tomorrow frightened them more than any rebellion ever could. The mobile slave never explained how he knew. No one ever recorded him claiming divine visions or secret knowledge. He would simply state the inevitable with the quiet authority of someone announcing rain before a storm, as if death revealed itself to him in patterns no one else could see. Sometimes he would fall into a distant stare moments before speaking, as though listening to voices carried on a wind that bypassed the physical world. And when he returned his gaze to reality, the next name was already sealed in his mind. Soon, people began seeking him out not with chains, but with trembling hope. They approached cautiously, offering water, bread, or whispered questions, asking if their names would ever leave his lips. Mothers clutched their children tighter when he passed. Lovers exchanged fearful glances, and strong men who once laughed at superstition watched his every movement for signs of another prophecy preparing to form. Still, he remained unchanged, his role as wanderer neither elevated nor relieved, his life continuing in servitude even as his words held the power to unsettle entire communities. Each time he spoke, the weight of his predictions settled heavier in the world, and yet he carried himself with the same resigned composure, as though he was merely a messenger for something ancient and patient, something that circled humanity unnoticed until the moment it chose to reveal itself. And as the first chain on his ankle scraped against stone and dust with every slow step, the fear that surrounded him began to grow not from hatred, but from the possibility that the future was not as invisible as they once believed, and that this silent wanderer, trapped between obedience and foresight, was only beginning to unveil the terrifying rhythm of what was yet to come, while his eyes remained fixed on a path stretching endlessly forward into uncertainty and shadowed inevitability, where the boundary between fate and warning continued to blur into something far more unsettling and strangely calm than anyone was prepared to understand or confront. As his quiet voice prepared itself once again to shape the next whisper of what waited just beyond the present heartbeat of time, an existence unfolding around him in slow measured silence broken only by the soft echo of chains against the ground and the distant breath of a world unaware of how closely it walked beside the edge of its own unseen ending, and the strange man who carried its secrets without ever being allowed to carry his own freedom, or decide whether the knowledge burning inside him was a gift, a punishment, or a prophecy that refused to release its hold upon his soul and the countless lives that crossed his path under a sky that seemed suddenly heavier with meaning and unspoken dread as his presence continued forward through dust and memory and the fragile illusion of safety that slowly dissolved with every step he took into the waiting, unknown flow of time, where his next words already lingered somewhere beyond the grasp of those who dared to listen, and those who prayed they never would within the quiet stillness that wrapped around his figure, as though the world itself paused to absorb the weight of what he carried within his silent, unyielding gaze and the unbroken chain of moments, stretching endlessly before him without mercy or conclusion. The moment the second keynote began to unfold, the world around the mobile slave shifted from uneasy rumor to undeniable terror, as 12 individuals, each named in his calm and unwavering voice, met their ends with a precision so exact that even coincidence felt like an impossible excuse. It was no longer hearsay whispered by frightened villagers, or exaggerated tales passed between trembling lips, but a trail of undeniable events marked by time, place, and circumstance, each one tracing back to the same chained figure who walked in silence and spoke only when death pressed its presence into his awareness. The first few predictions already felt like an omen, but as the count climbed steadily, the pattern grew impossible to dismiss, and the air itself seemed to tense with every step he took forward. He never raised his voice or dramatized his words. He simply stated what would happen, how it would happen, and when it would happen, as though reading lines from a script etched somewhere beyond sight. A merchant would die before sunset by falling from his horse at the bend near the old stone bridge. A young stable boy would slip and break his neck while feeding the restless horses at dawn. An overseer would meet his end alone under the shade of the same tree where he once whipped others without mercy. Each prediction carried such unsettling detail that those who heard it felt as if they were witnessing the future being spoken into existence. And yet the mobile slave remained detached, as though the outcome no longer held emotional weight for him. when the deaths began to align perfectly with his words. The atmosphere around him thickened with dread. People counted the names quietly, whispering among themselves as if keeping track of an invisible score, 1, 2, 3, until the number 12 lingered like a shadow waiting to be completed. They watched the faces of the condemned change as the day approached, saw the panic in their eyes, the desperate attempts to alter their fate, the frantic avoidance of every place mentioned, yet none of it mattered. The ones destined to die still walked straight into the ending already described, as if the knowledge of their fate only tightened the invisible thread pulling them closer. Some tried to challenge it, to bend the prediction by leaving town, hiding indoors, or seeking protection from religious figures who claimed divine intervention could cancel the curse. Others laughed defiantly, refusing to grant power to the words of a slave, only to find themselves silenced by the same fate carved into time with patient accuracy. Each death reinforced the horror, each coincidence sharpened the belief that the mobile slave was not merely foreseeing the inevitable, but announcing an unchanging truth that no effort could defy. His presence became a point of anxious focus wherever he went. Conversations would stop as he passed. Eyes followed his movements not with sympathy, but with fearful calculation, wondering who would be named next, whose life would be quietly unmade before it even reached its final hour. Parents shut their doors tighter, lovers held hands longer, and men who once believed themselves untouchable stared at him with the same vulnerability as frightened children. And still, the mobile slave never sought recognition, never acknowledged the fear that swirled around him like smoke, continuing to walk under the weight of his chains as if the burden of knowledge was just another part of his unchosen existence. As the 12th prediction approached, tension stretched through the community like a taut wire ready to snap. Each day that passed without his voice added more pressure to the silence, until the moment he finally spoke the name that completed the pattern. The shock rippled instantly, as if the announcement itself had already begun the countdown, and all attention turned to the last marked soul as if witnessing the slow unraveling of time. When that final person met their end exactly as foretold, down to the smallest detail, disbelief no longer existed. Only the chilling realization that what he spoke was not speculation, but certainty shaped by forces no one could comprehend. The mobile slave became a living symbol of fatal inevitability, a reminder that death could be measured not just in moments, but in words spoken far in advance. People no longer questioned whether he was right, but feared the moment their own name might pass his lips. They avoided his gaze, turned their faces when he walked by, and yet could not stop listening for the faint murmur of his voice each time he paused, as if sensing another vision forming. The accuracy of the 12 deaths carved a permanent scar across the collective mind of every witness, embedding itself into their perception of time as fragile and unpredictable. No one dared speak too loudly in his presence anymore. The air around him felt heavy, as though invisible hands pressed down on reason itself, and even those who preached logic found their convictions dissolving beneath the weight of what they had seen. Every match between his words and reality fueled more fear, while the unanswered question of how he knew hung like a silent echo with no source to trace. The mobile slave became more than a man. He became an omen moving through flesh and bone, a quiet herald of endings no one could prevent. Yet with every fulfilled prediction, there was also an unsettling familiarity, as if death had a routine rhythm and he was merely announcing its next step, a messenger forced to recite lines that could not be erased. His eyes carried no triumph, no sorrow, only the tired awareness of someone who understood that knowledge itself could be a prison more confining than any chain. The people he named fell one by one, the pattern complete, leaving behind stunned silence and a lingering terror that clung to the air. Long after the bodies had been buried and the ceremonies finished, and still he walked, still the rhythm of iron against ground echoed through pathways and fields. Still the waiting world listened for the next impossible certainty, breathing in fear and disbelief while his presence remained unchanged, moving forward beneath the twilight sky, surrounded by glances that no longer saw a slave, but a walking threshold between life and its unavoidable conclusion, as if the future itself had taken form in a man who was never meant to hold power, and yet now carried a truth that unsettled the very foundation of safety and certainty in a world forced to confront how fragile every borrowed breath truly was, as each passing moment hung suspended between what had already been spoken and what had yet to be revealed in the quiet tension that claimed every corner he passed through, and every heartbeat that trembled at the thought of being next on the list that had already proven It did not lie and did not falter and did not allow escape, while the shadow of 12 perfect endings stretched endlessly behind him and the silent expectation of more lingered ahead like an unseen horizon, waiting patiently beyond the narrow stretch of time, an awareness that separated the living from the words he might speak again, without warning or mercy or relief. As fear began to spread through the towns and plantations that lay in the wandering path of the mobile slave, the question of whether his knowledge was supernatural or something far darker became an obsession that infected every conversation and every sleepless night. No one could agree on a single explanation, and yet everyone felt the same tightening dread whenever his quiet figure appeared at the edge of a road or standing motionless beneath a pale sky. Some swore that unseen spirits walked beside him, whispering secrets of the future into his thoughts, while others believed he had made an unholy pact with forces that thrive on human endings, and the lack of certainty only sharpened the fear that already clung to his presence. Religious elders gathered to debate his existence, their voices hushed and uneasy as they spoke of divine signs and forbidden knowledge, wondering if he had been chosen as a vessel or marked as a warning. They pored over sacred texts and half-forgotten scriptures, searching desperately for a line that might explain how a man bound by chains could speak with authority over life and death. Yet the answers refused to reveal themselves, leaving only more speculation that fueled the growing sense of unease. Villagers listened intently to every theory, clinging to any possibility that might restore a sense of order, but no explanation ever felt strong enough to outweigh the evidence etched into the ground by 12 perfectly predicted graves. Some insisted it was not magic, but manipulation, claiming the mobile slave somehow orchestrated the deaths from the shadows, using subtle influence and careful planning to make his words come true. Yet no one could discover the method, no whispers of rehearsal, no clues of hidden movements, only the uncomfortable reality that he spoke and time followed suit. Others argued he was not causing death, but merely sensing it, reading patterns too complex for ordinary minds, like a man who could see storms forming before clouds even began to gather, watching the invisible currents of fate long before they reached the surface of reality. The more people speculated, the further logic seemed to drift away. Every attempt to rationalize him only deepened the sense that the truth rested somewhere beyond human understanding. Mothers began drawing protective symbols on their doors. Travelers avoided crossing paths with him, and children grew up hearing his name spoken with the same caution reserved for legends and nightmares. He had become a subject of both fascination and terror, a living riddle that no belief system could properly contain, and every new death whispered his predictions further into the collective memory of the world around him. The mobile slave himself remained distant from the chaos of speculation that followed him, as if he existed in a separate layer of reality, untouched by the storm of fear he inspired. He walked with the same measured pace, eyes heavy with quiet awareness, as though he carried the knowledge that arguments and theories meant nothing against what he already knew. When people confronted him, demanding answers, begging for explanations, he offered none, leaving them with silence thick enough to feel like a presence of its own, a void where reassurance should have lived out. As the days passed, the tension between belief and doubt grew sharper. Some began to revere him, viewing his words as sacred warnings meant to prepare the world for what could not be avoided. They followed him at a distance, listening carefully for every murmur, treating his predictions like scripture written in living breath. Others despised him, blaming him for the fear that poisoned their sleep, calling him a harbinger of doom whose very existence invited disaster. And still none of them could bring themselves to forget a single word he spoke. The mystery itself grew heavier with every passing moment. If his power was supernatural, then what unseen hand guided it? If it was something darker, something rooted in forbidden knowledge or hidden cruelty, then what price had he paid to hold such certainty? And if it was neither, if he was merely a man cursed with clarity too sharp for the world to bear, then what did that mean for those who could not see beyond the present breath? Every possibility carried its own fear, each more unsettling than the last. People began telling stories late into the night, inventing explanations where truth refused to form, describing visions of him standing between worlds, half in shadow and half in light, listening to whispers that came from beyond the edge of perception. They imagined unseen figures guiding his steps, marking the ground where his chains dragged as if tracing a symbolic path only fate could recognize. Each version added to his legend, transforming him further from human into something almost mythic, a bridge between certainty and terror that no one knew how to cross. Yet he never embraced the identity others tried to give him. He remained what he had always been, a silent wanderer forced into motion by invisible ownership, carrying within him a knowledge that no one fully understood. His stillness in the face of fear disturbed people even more than his predictions, as though he had already accepted something the rest of the world could not yet grasp, something resting calmly behind his distant gaze. The endless speculation carved new layers of anxiety into everyday life. Every creak of wood, every sudden silence, every unexpected sound seemed charged with meaning, as though the mystery surrounding him had altered how people perceived their own existence. They began to see time as fragile, moments as temporary, breath as something that could vanish the instant his voice chose a name, and still the question of how he knew remained unanswered. Drifting like a shadow that refused to settle into shape, some prayed for his disappearance, convinced that without him the cycle of fear might break, while others feared what would happen if he ever stopped speaking, worrying that his silence might signal something even worse waiting just beyond comprehension. The uncertainty twisted around every thought, leaving a quiet ache beneath the surface of daily life, a constant reminder that the world was no longer as predictable as they once believed. And through it all, the mobile slave walked on, chained, yet unknowable, his presence a moving question mark etched into the landscape of reality, his quiet existence challenging every certainty about life, death, and the unseen forces that move between them, as if each step he took carried not only the weight of iron, but the gravity of a truth that refused to reveal itself fully and instead lingered just beyond reach, just beyond explanation, just beyond the fragile line that separates reason from dread and curiosity from terror, while the whispers about what he truly was continued to swell and ripple and echo through every corner he passed, leaving behind a trail of wonder and unease that refused to soften or fade, and only grew deeper as his silent form moved forward beneath a sky that seemed to watch him as intently as those who feared and followed and questioned and wondered. What unseen source fed the strange cold certainty that lived behind his eyes and shaped the tension that wrapped around his presence like an invisible veil of unanswered thought and restless doubt and cautious reverence and frightened imagination, in a world slowly surrendering to the mystery that walked among them, without offering a single word of explanation or comfort or release. As the mystery deepened and the shadow of his fulfilled predictions stretched further across the land, an unsettling transformation took place in the way those who held power began to see the mobile slave, for even his masters, once confident in their authority and ownership, started to feel a creeping terror coil around their thoughts. The same men who ordered his movements, who demanded his silence and obedience, now watched him with unease, measuring every pause in his step, every distant look in his eyes, as if the slightest change in his behavior might signal a name about to be spoken, a fate about to be sealed, and the possibility that it could be theirs pressed heavily against their sense of control. Their fear did not show openly at first. It appeared in subtle shifts, in the way their voices faltered when addressing him, in the way their hands hesitated before issuing commands, in the restless glances they exchanged whenever he stood, to still or gazed long into nothingness. The idea that a man they considered inferior could possess knowledge beyond their reach unsettled them more deeply than defiance or rebellion, because this was not a threat that could be crushed with force, not a resistance that could be beaten into submission, but a quiet presence that moved calmly through their world carrying truths they could not command or silence. Some tried to reclaim power through intimidation, increasing his labor, tightening his restraints, surrounding him with guards as if iron and violence could bind not only his body, but whatever strange sight lived within his mind. Others attempted a different approach, offering him small comforts, softer tones, even a twisted form of kindness, hoping that if he felt favored, he might choose to reveal whether their own names rested in his future vision. Yet the mobile slave gave nothing in response, neither reassurance nor threat, only the same distant composure that left them trapped in their own imagination, where every possibility of doom felt vividly real. They began to listen more closely to every word he spoke, analyzing each tone, each pause, searching for hidden meaning as though his silence itself contained warnings. When he walked past them without acknowledgement, relief mingled with suspicion, and when he lingered nearby, the air thickened with anticipation, as if invisible hands had tightened around their chests. Nights became restless, filled with dreams that blurred into visions of him standing quietly at the foot of their beds, his voice calmly reciting their inevitable end, a whisper they could not escape even when awake. The power imbalance that once defined their relationship began to shift in subtle psychological ways. They still owned his body, still dictated his movements, yet they could not own the fear he inspired. And that fear slowly eroded the illusion of invincibility they had built around themselves. Each creak of floorboards, each sudden silence, each unexpected moment of stillness from him felt like a prelude to revelation, a moment carrying the weight of fate hovering just beyond perception. Among themselves, they debated what should be done with him, whether he should be isolated, silenced forever, or perhaps used as a tool to anticipate dangers that threatened their position. Yet none of their discussions reached a conclusion, because no decision felt safe, no choice free from the shadow of consequence. To harm him might provoke whatever unseen force guided his predictions. To spare him might mean living endlessly under the threat of hearing their own names pronounced. And so they remained trapped in cautious indecision, watching the very man they controlled become the source of their deepest unspoken dread. In private moments, their thoughts turned darker. They wondered if his vision stretched beyond death into something more. If he saw not only endings, but the unraveling of power, the collapse of certainty, the fragile truth behind the roles they clung to so tightly. The fear that he might speak of them did not only threaten their lives, it threatened the narrative they told themselves about dominance and permanence, about control and superiority, about being above those they ruled. And that silent challenge cut deeper than any blade. Even their interactions with others began to change, their tempers shorter, their decisions clouded by the quiet pressure of uncertainty. They watched his every movement not as an act of authority, but as an attempt to read the future, written behind his eyes, to anticipate something they could neither prevent nor fully understand. The paradox was inescapable. The more they tried to exert control, the more they revealed their vulnerability, the more they sought reassurance, the more they acknowledged his power, without ever granting him freedom. The mobile slave remained caught within this tension, a man both feared and controlled, his existence balancing precariously between servitude and influence. He did not exploit their terror, did not taunt them with the possibility of doom, yet his very presence altered the emotional landscape of their world. Every command issued to him carried an unspoken plea beneath it, a desperate hope that obedience might somehow protect them from his knowledge, that their authority might shield them from the fate he announced so calmly for others. As days passed and nights blurred into anxious silence, their fear grew less dramatic and more consuming, like a slow poison that seeped into their thoughts and made even ordinary moments feel charged with significance. The sweet comfort of certainty they once enjoyed dissolved, replaced by the awareness that power did not guarantee safety and that a quiet chained man walking beside them could hold a truth more terrifying than any open rebellion. They began to sense that his silence was not weakness, but something far heavier, a quiet acceptance of knowledge that could not be undone. The thought that he might already know how their own stories ended lingered constantly at the edge of their consciousness, making every glance toward him feel like a question, and every unanswered look from him feel like a warning to heavy to voice. The world around them continued its routines, the sun rising and setting, work unfolding as it always had. Yet beneath this surface normality trembled a deep, invisible uncertainty, carried on the quiet rhythm of his chains and the silent awareness that what he spoke was not fantasy, but something that had already proven its place in reality. And as he moved among them, still bound in body yet impossible to bind in knowledge, the dread that his masters tried so desperately to suppress remained close, coiled and watchful, listening for a name, listening for a pause, listening for the moment his calm voice might slip once more into the air and bend the certainty of another life, without granting anyone the comfort of knowing whether the next whisper belonged to stranger, servant, or the very men who held his chains and whispered their own fears behind closed doors as their once unquestioned dominance dissolved into uneasy silence and restless anticipation under the quiet, steady presence of the man who walked beside them carrying truths they could not command, at futures they could not escape, and a lingering sense that the unseen boundary between ruler and ruled had never felt so fragile or so close to being undone by a single breath softly shaping a name that had not yet been spoken, but already waited somewhere beyond their control and grasp in trembling authority, within the slow unfolding path of time that neither iron nor power nor fear could ever truly restrain. And in the suffocating silence that followed every fulfilled prediction, one truth stood taller than fear itself, that power had bowed before knowledge, and certainty had surrendered to the whisper of a chained man, the mobile slave, stripped of freedom yet crowned by fate, became the living proof that even the smallest voice could shake the foundations of control, that even iron could not imprison truth, and that destiny does not always roar from thrones, but sometimes murmurs through the most forgotten soul. His existence shattered the illusion that life bends to status, wealth, or command, revealing instead that time walks its own path, indifferent to rank or cruelty. Where others ruled with force, he ruled with inevitability, and in doing so, exposed the fragile arrogance of those who believed they owned the world. In the end, his quiet presence became more than a mystery of death. It became a haunting reminder that no chain is heavier than the future, no authority stronger than fate, and no silence more powerful than the voice that dares to speak what cannot be undone.